Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's lovely to see you. I'm James Whittle, composer-conductor, and I'm very glad to be sat here with Emily Crossland and Ben Gaunt, who have written two new pieces for us we'll hear later tonight, Carina's Observatory and 1v4v. I'd just like to start by asking where these pieces came from, really. Emily, can you kick us off?
Okay. I was trying to think about this earlier on. I thought I probably ought to have an answer for this. I'm sorry to tell you I didn't do particularly well, because it's come from lots of different influences. Well, when James and I first met about this piece, I was talking about this idea of Balinese kecak, which I don't know if anybody knows, just briefly. It's a kind of vocal chant that happens in Bali, I think mainly for tourists these days, but sort of kind of fast interlocking vocal chant. And I've always been quite interested in that. I've used it with vocal music before. I wanted to see how it might work with instrumental music. So that was the first starting point. The other starting point was theatre. I do a lot of work with a company called Engine Room Theatre, and a lot of that is about how audiences get involved and how theatre can be kind of very sort of personal, and it doesn't have to be a big barrier between what happens up here and what happens out in the audience. So there was that interest in the back of my mind as well. And then I suppose the third main one was Javanese gamelan, so heading back to Indonesia again. I play a lot of Javanese gamelan, have for about 10 years or so. And so just, I just wanted to see how those three elements fitted together into a piece, which hopefully we will find out tonight if they do fit together into a piece.
Yes, yeah. We can talk titles and maybe give some clues in a bit later.
Yes, indeed.
First of all, can you hear us all okay? Great, do just say if you can't. Thank you. Ben, can you tell us a little bit about Carina's Observatory?
Yeah, sure. Looking into the programme, you'll notice my programme note is quite short. One of the reasons for this, apart from being a lazy person inherently, is that that it's a really incoherent concept for a piece of music, and I found it very, very difficult to put into words that made sense. But I'm going to give it a go now on the fly, so we'll see what happens here. Went to visit Jethro Bagust shortly before Christmas, which is a massive telescope near Manchester, or a bank of telescopes even, and saw a picture of the Carina Nebula, with a collection of stars very far away. And one of the things that I saw there were some on a picture were some pillars of dust, and these pillars are massive, millions of light years long, absolutely huge, and they're gradually being eroded away by light. And I found that quite bizarre. And they're also extremely destructive and creative forces as well. They're constantly a furnace for new stars, and they're destroying other stars as well. And I found this absolutely fascinating. So started thinking about this idea of the Carina Nebula, and there's a star in the Carina Nebula that's about to go supernova and blow up, and when that happens, supernova explosion jettisons heavy elements into space, and that's where we come from, that's where the Earth comes from, and everything on the Earth comes from. And I got obsessed with this idea of this star exploding and jettisoning things into space, and then these heavy elements collecting somewhere and then being used to create an observatory on some other planet. I don't know why I thought of that, but that is what happened. And I kind of got obsessed also with the idea of pillars, these pillars of dust, and also this kind of cyclical connection, because the stands on which telescopes are placed are called pillars. And then also I was reading recently about Wagner, and he describes his music as having pillars of sound, events you might call them, things that happen, and he talks about how he connects one event to another, and that's kind of where the piece started. I then wrote the piece 3 times.
As you do.
Things went horribly wrong, and that's fine, because that happens, as I'm sure you've experienced as well, and you have as well.
Oh, yeah.
It's a process of composition, and I'm very happy with this third one, and actually in writing it, some of those influences have kind of died away, but that's fine.
Great, thank you. So we've ended up with 2 quite different pieces in terms of how you've used your ensemble. Emily's is for vibraphone and string quartet, and Ben's is for the full complement of 8 we've got this year. Emily, can you explain a little bit about this title, Ben, and so we can start to see?
Well, usually find it quite hard to decide on a title for pieces. And I tend to end up with a working title that just kind of pootles along while I'm writing. And this one kind of came to me as I was writing, and I thought, oh, but that's spot on. That's actually it. I suppose it started from the idea that there's one vibraphone, so the 1V, and 4 stringed instruments that also happen to begin with V, violins and violas and violoncello. So I kind of have this 1V and 4V. But also there's a bit of a battle going on in this piece. The string players aren't necessarily behaving at their best. And that's intentional. That's not just the ensemble being naughty. It's as part of the piece.
It's quite easy to rehearse, actually.
It came naturally, did it? So, this idea of one player versus the other 4 doing their own thing. So that's where it started. And then I kind of looked at it written down and realised that there was an awful lot of similarities to the what's called Kapatihan cipher notation that you write gamelan music down in, which obviously big influence on the piece. With that system you'd have, so gamelan music is written in numbers. You'd have numbers 1 to 7 or 1 to 6, depending on your tuning. And then you'd have various brackets and sort of hats and V's and crosses and symbols that go alongside that, just to instruct you which other instruments to play. So it ended up with these V's, these numbers, these brackets and things that looked rather similar to the influence it had come from. So for once, my working title actually stuck.
Right. I mean, we've got 2 pieces that work very differently, and I find that my question with yours, with the theatre, is how you went through whether it was a sort of I've got this idea and then it should go on to this next thing, sort of, because it's that we have a story in this piece in the theatre. In Ben's, it's a really interesting process that happens. What drew me to commissioning both of these composers, well, I'll say with Ben first, was the sort of the energy and to the structures that you managed to create. And each piece is completely different. You never know quite how it's going to turn out. But and that's that must be part of the joy of it. I mean, you talked in rehearsal about these well, we could say modules, these blocks of material that we hear at various times. Can you say something about how you ended up putting them together? Because we've got quite different sounds. Sometimes we only will hear one thing once.
Yeah, oh god, yeah, that's quite complicated. Right, let's try this. So the commission was for a piece of 6 to 8 minutes, and I opted for 6 minutes, which is 360 seconds. And I kind of got obsessed a little bit with that number, because I was talking about universes and things like that, and then 360 degrees full field of vision. And then had a look more at the number 360, and it has 24 divisors. And I got interested in 24 because that's the number of hours in a day, and started thinking about. It's kind of hard to describe. Let me go back a little bit. So another thing that I'd imagined when writing this piece was a geocentric model of the universe where the Earth is at the centre and all the stars and the planets are around it. And so I imagined my musical material kind of floating around the listener and then coming back. So you'd have something that rotates once and you only get once in a piece, something that rotates twice and you get twice in a piece, something that rotates quicker and you get something that happens 36 times. So what I did is I picked, of these 24 divisors that comprise the number 360, I picked 12 of them. So you will hear something that happens once, which is the kind of Carina star explosion, and then you'll hear certain things that happen twice, thrice, 4 times, etc. Yeah, that's basically it.
Right. I mean, I thought this might be an interesting way to get inside what we're going to hear, because in rehearsal, what was fascinating about this material is that each time it comes back, it has to be the same each time. But the other thing is that because of the scoring at these times where we have something that's very sparse texture-wise, but the fragments might have a louder dynamic, but it's decided that you're playing it as if it's a background object rather than at the foreground, and so we've got a really interesting interplay between foreground and background in this material. And I mean, we don't have to go too far into the structure to give the game away as how it will unfold for you. But and that was a really interesting conversation we had in rehearsal.
It was impacted on the way the players approached it. I think that was positive.
Yeah, we talked about sort of anti-solos and things.
Yeah, it's something happening on its own, but it isn't played like a solo. It's not projected in that way because it just happens to have spun around you at that particular point, as it were.
Yes, and then there's an almost an interesting take on the solo in your piece, Emily. I'm trying to think about how much we can really say without also spoiling the game, as it were, particularly with a theatre piece. But perhaps, since it was through your work with Engine Room and Castaway, that's again thoughts to commission you. There was. Can you talk a little bit about because there was one idea for the piece that you started with from the show Midsummer Night's Dream.
James and I have led sort of an interesting double or triple life, kind of crossing paths in many different ways. So I suppose there's several projects that have led to this. Working with Castaway over in Gaunt, who are a sort of very large community organisation, who commissioned me to write a piece sort of for and with them, and then brought James in to conduct and further develop the piece with them as well. So that kind of started the teamwork, and then we went on to take that piece and then several other bits of music that I wrote into a production of Midsummer Night's Dream. And at that point we started kind of getting intrigued by audience interaction, not just with the theatre but with the music as well. Could we get the audience to play part of the music with us? So kind of had the first dabblings of that in Midsummer Night's Dream, which involved some of the fairies going out and taking bells, handheld bells, to members of the audience and just conducting them, showing them where to play it, and it being quite free. But Puck was the conductor for that bit, just led people through it. So we started off with that idea, hadn't we, of what can you ask an audience to do without rehearsal in a piece of music or in a piece of theatre. And so that was an interesting learning point. I mean, there was lots that was very fun with that. There was lots where I found myself with more questions. How can you refine that? How can you go on to shape that as a piece of music where you've got a bit more control over what happens when? So really, I think this was the point where I explored that further. So maybe be prepared.
Yes.
Be not afraid.
And we'll come back to that sort of thing later, actually, as far as participation goes. Hint. So I'd like to get on to talking about Terry Riley, which is what the theme of our concert is today, and how we've arrived at the programme we have. But I'm keen to open up a dialogue here, so maybe compare what you took, because I think all I said was that's we're going to finish with it in C. Yeah. Seminal 1964 classic minimalism, all that sort of thing. Where does that feature in these pieces tonight for you?
I think for me, because I discussed beforehand that I wrote the piece 3 times and the first 2 times were unsuccessful. I think with each iteration of this piece, it got less and less Riley influenced, I'm afraid. But there are some things that I take away from it. And actually, I think probably more than anything, it's some gestural material that I basically outright nicked from In C. One thing in particular is the repeated note that you get in C, the repeated C. I nicked that. It's not the most magnificent gesture in the world, but I nicked that. I like that kind of pulse, and I kind of fade in and out of that pulse and play it at different speeds. And then the later cells that occur, I think it's the 52nd and the 53rd ones, which are those tremolandi between the 2 pitches. I nick and put into the piano and kind of intersperse through the piece as well. So not much, but a little bit.
Yeah, there's something maybe to be said for the cosmic theme as well.
Yeah.
Emily.
Well, I suppose it's quite an interesting thing for me really. I realised something that. First of all, when I was at school and I first heard gamelan, I couldn't stand it. And when I was at college and I first played In C, I couldn't stand it. So I promise that's not where the link stops, though. And interestingly, coming back to gamelan much later, actually getting to play it for the first time at university and then falling promptly in love with it and never stopping playing it since, a whole new understanding came along. And I think this, slightly to my embarrassment, is probably the first moment that I've had the same sort of thing with In C. that actually I've come back to it with more mature musical eyes and seen things that I just totally would have glossed over as a 16, 17-year-old when I didn't really engage with it in that way. So I think it's been very interesting to think about that sort of flexibility that you've got within C and the layers of music. I think that's been something that appeals to me, not necessarily just with this piece, with 1v4v, but just generally realising how much that appeals to me as a composer. And I think also, having had, I suppose, a relationship with minimalism where, I've not been wildly excited by it before, it's been a really fascinating time to kind of, again, look with new eyes and to make different decisions with my own composition that I wouldn't normally do. Things like going, no, that's okay to have something that's looping. This is fine. This is just, this is finding out something new about my writing. So it's been a fantastic opportunity to do that and to sort of push into I guess it feels a bit like I was saying before, like a new stage of writing, the permission to try something different. So, I suppose there's lots of different ways that I suppose Riley and minimalism more generally have fed into this.
Yes, and you've touched on a couple of compositional problems that we sometimes have, is this keeping fresh ears and not presuming things that we've learned from pieces. There's always something more interesting to be gained from a piece, even if it's completely not your taste and you really, really hate it. There's always something to look at. It's a tough skill sometimes when you're running out of ideas. And the other one, which now escapes me because I've talked too much.
Well, I remember one thing as a composition student is... I should say this, but I remember distinctly being disencouraged from writing minimalist music or from repeating things too many times. I went to the Royal Northern, and I don't know whether all universities and conservatories work in the same way, but it was discouraged. But I think since leaving that place and kind of forging my own path, I've come to take them on board again. These techniques which tried and tested worked and sound great.
Yes, that was the other one actually reminded me of. This composing in a vacuum, or composing in a culture which has given you certain things in your experience, and trying to build on all that and figure your own way out. Because each piece can push you forward in ways which you can't imagine.
I don't think you can compose in a vacuum. I don't think you can.
Well, I don't think you'd last very long.
I don't think you
can. One thing actually I've remembered. There's a YouTube video where Steve Reich is being interviewed by some chap, and the chap says, "So, we've talked about your music and where it's gone to in recent years, but take me back. Let's go back to where it started. What about that piece in C?" And Steve instantly goes, "Well," and gets a huge frown on him, and says, that would be a very different piece if it weren't for that pulse, because that pulse was my suggestion in rehearsal, and if you can imagine it without that pulse, it's a very dry piece. They did it in." I think he quotes Latvia or an Eastern European country, and says, and it was very introverted, So we're doing it with the pulse tonight, but I think that both I and you should probably give Steve Reich his credit for those pulsing C's. We've got it on record now.
Yeah. Fantastic.
I mean, and what you're also saying about listening, to say a little bit more about the program here tonight. The thing that I've taken from in C, at least, is this the sense of the group, the collective listening experience. And this is where you, as the audience, do come into this in an active sense, I hope. I'll explain a little bit more about the Oliveros. But in an ensemble context, yes, where it's improvised, and your ear has to be really in tune to what each decision is being made and how people are situating themselves in the overall sound. And we've got that in Ben's piece, I think. It's just composed out. Would you agree? Yeah,
I think that's a fair way of looking at it. Actually, I was considering rendering the piece differently at one point, using stopwatches and having each instrument have their own loop of things occurring at different times. But I didn't in the end. But I might do it in a future piece. I have thought of ideas of having a kind of a communal stopwatch and things happening at specific intervals along it, which would be more itch in C-like.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting phrase. I think in the John Luther Adams piece, I think I am pretty much the communal stopwatch. The trick with that piece will be to not watch me, because I'll be beating, but it won't sound like that, so don't watch me in that piece. we've talked a lot about Riley and these pieces. Maybe we can say something, or explore something more about our general attitudes to composition. Is there always a clear starting block? We can maybe bring in some questions in a second. But before we do, is there anything that's new that's you found in writing these pieces recently, or what do you think the next step is? Is there a next piece even?
Well, I think for me the really interesting development has been that developing the theatre alongside developing the music. That was a big kind of wrestling match for me, was going, is the music coherent? But is the theatre coherent? Do they work together? And it feels like that's something I want to continue looking at, continue asking, especially as we carry on doing things with engineering theatre, where again the whole thing is about all the art forms coming together to work as a whole. So I think that for me has been different to other compositions that I've done, where generally I'm thinking about the music, or possibly thinking mainly about the theatre side of it. So yeah, I think it was the balance of the two that's been different this time.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, for me as well, it's kind of an important piece, this one, I feel. As lately as a year ago, and all the way through my PhD, I was influenced by a composer called Gerard Grisey, whose thoughts on composition were that we work in sound. We don't work in architecture. We don't work in art. We don't work in literature. We work in sound and sound alone. Which I'm sure you completely disagree with, given that you do theatrical things, and I know you do as well. So you would also completely disagree with. But I was kind of working along those lines, and then recently came to the decision that I was dissatisfied with everything I'd written before I was 30, and started again, as it were, and have decided to accept external stimuli and not compose in a vacuum and read and go to art galleries and take everything in. And this is the second piece that has external non-musical stimuli. And I think, it's a breakthrough piece in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Which was the first piece that had some external stimuli?
It was a trio I wrote that I think only 3 people in the audience have heard. My parents and my sister.
Right. But is this particular piece on SoundCloud?
Yes, I believe it is on SoundCloud.
So this piece is on SoundCloud, so maybe more than 3 people could hear it.
Yeah, exactly, that's true. Good point. Yeah.
Right. You see, we're dropping all the hints today. Right, well, I think that's a good point at which we can say, are there any questions from anyone in the audience? Looks like we've talked you out. Maybe you're going to stay for some music soon. I'm all done with questions, so thank you very much, Emily and Ben. Look forward to hearing pieces later.
Cheers, thank you.